Welcome once again to The Blueprints. This is Canada's Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, with new content for you every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. On today's show, well, we're not talking about the federal government looking into the impact of wood-fired pizza ovens. No, we are going to talk about a federal judge deciding that the use of the Emergencies Act a year ago was unconstitutional. Talk about that and much, much more. Is the Brockinator, Larry Brock, the one and only Member of Parliament for Brantford Brant. Thank you for being on the show.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Always a pleasure.
It is always a pleasure having you, and my goodness, the topics just keep going with this.
Never endless.
Federal judge says unconstitutional use of the Emergencies Act, something I think we all litigated in the House of Commons when that bill was up for debate. And of course, the Liberal and NDP squads, they voted in favor of that. So they have a lot to wear on this.
Yes, and they do, because you also have to remember the Prime Minister, all his cabinet members, his caucus were all parroting the same talking point, that the invocation, their decision to invoke this never been used, extremely powerful federal law was charter compliant. Mm-hmm. They refused to release the legal opinion, which suggested that it was charter compliant. One of the frustrations that Justice Rouleau had in the Rouleau Commission when he was questioning former Justice Minister David Lametti, and basically said, I take it you're not going to release the legal opinion, so we are then to accept your word for it, that it was charter compliant? Justice Lametti said, yes, take my word. Well, how ironic that the word, obviously, was the complete opposite. Justice Mosley, I believe his name is pronounced, of the federal court, a very learned justice on the bench for well over 2 decades, heard evidence, same evidence largely that Justice Rouleau heard, but came to a completely different decision. And there's one thing you have to keep in mind. Justice Rouleau wasn't charged with the responsibility of determining the legality behind the invocation of the act, although in his former capacity he was in a position to rule on charter breaches and guilt or innocence of an accused party in his former career. But in his role as a commissioner, his role was determine whether the federal government was reasonable in its approach to the invocation of the act. A far different standard. And the standard we have right now is we have a legal precedent that clearly says the government did not comply with 2 sections of the Charter. Section 8, which is the right to be secure against unreasonable search and seizure, the issue regarding the seizing of the bank accounts, the reporting requirements that the banks had to report back to FinTract. These are serious actions taken by the federal government. Chrystia Freeland was claiming that this was being funded by terrorists and
money laundering,
and being funded by foreign entities, all of which completely untrue. But she had the government accept that version, and she established that as a justification for her use of those wide-sweeping banking powers. So we have that infraction. We also have the infraction of Section 2, the freedom to express oneself, right? We have to remember that the genesis, the origin of this conflict, this protest that we had in Ottawa over 2 years ago, was a decision made by Justin Trudeau and the government to impose different regulations on long-distance truck drivers, mandating that they get the shots. And if they didn't get the shots, they wouldn't be allowed to continue their living and cross the borders. Well, several thousands and thousands of truckers, international truckers, did comply with that order, but there was still a significant portion of Canadian truckers that said, you, Mr. Trudeau, and your government will not dictate what I put into my body. And how ironic that that was the same sort of position that our Prime Minister had taken and said, no government should impose any vaccine mandates on its citizens. So how quickly the narrative can change depending on the situation. So Justice Mosley was very, very clear that the facts weren't there to justify the invocation of the act. The legal threshold was not met by the federal government. There was no national emergency as defined under the CSIS Act. Section 2 of the CSIS Act was contained within the Emergencies Act legislation. So what this does is a very stark reminder and a warning to this government and any future governments that you are not at liberty to interpret the laws that suit your narrative. That's exactly what Justin Trudeau did when this became a political embarrassment, not a national emergency affecting Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
So just to recap, we were talking about the, I guess many people call it a trucker convoy in Ottawa that happened a few years ago. And you mentioned about the mandates, about people getting frustrated with the mandates. And let's remind people that at the point when Justin Trudeau was going to implement this mandate on the truckers, which, don't forget, they went the whole pandemic with when there was no vaccine. Back and forth, no problem. It was like, keep going, keep doing your job when the risk was the highest. And when the risk was starting to come down, then it was do as I say, which was really in opposition to what was happening in many governments around the world. Many governments, including the UK at the time, were starting to release some of their mandates. And it seemed like Justin Trudeau kind of liked that power. He liked the fact that he could tell people what to do, and then we were all supposed to say yes and march accordingly.
Yeah. He found a winning narrative that people believed this was the right thing to do to impose mandates on Canadians, but he amplified that position by dividing Canadians from coast to coast, calling them nasty names, very divisive names. He stoked that feeling of upset. He stoked that feeling.
Yeah, it only happened in the 2021 election when his numbers started to drop in the polls.
Precisely.
Like you said earlier, he was fine with no mandates,
Yes.
making the best personal choice. Talk to your doctor, healthcare professional, make the best choice
Yes.
for your individual situation. He was fine with that. It was only until the polls started to drop for him, he needed to do what he does best, which is divide Canadians in order to somewhat eke out an electoral victory.
Find a wedge issue.
Yeah, find a wedge issue.
And, you know, and the language I think that he used, as contrary and negative as it was, and how it angered many Canadians who did decide to participate in the convoy, Justice Rouleau himself really went so far to say he was very critical of the Prime Minister's use of that particular language as the core, sort of the cause of how this convoy sort of originated and developed over so many days.
Well, I have a question for you about the difference between this latest decision from the federal judge and the public inquiry, but I know you have a video here that I want to get to. So let's get super producer Nick to cue up cut one. We'll watch the video, and then I'll ask you that question when we come back.
Certainly.
Play cut one.
Many of you have just heard that Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act in 2022 was found both illegal and unconstitutional by a federal court. Quite a different outcome in comparison with the Rouleau Commission. That's what happens when it's not Trudeau's neighbor or ski buddy in charge of a report or a decision. The Emergencies Act imposed draconian restraints on Canadians. Most notably, Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau used it to freeze bank accounts of people and authorize the arrest of citizens for attending a peaceful protest voicing opposition to federal government policies. Today, more than ever, Canadians demand answers on how the Trudeau government reached the decision to use the Emergencies Act and the legal opinion behind it.
So what is the difference? The public inquiry seemed to side on the government on the use of the Emergencies Act, and now we have this latest decision saying it was unconstitutional.
There's a big fundamental difference between the two. So the Emergencies Act has a built-in review mechanism. There are two facets to that review mechanism. Within so many, I believe it's so many days, within the invocation of the Act, there has to be established a joint parliamentary special committee set up to review the circumstances behind the invocation of the act. That's a special committee composed of MPs of all parties, as well as a number of senators. So that has been ongoing, Jamie, for better part of 2.5 years. We have not completed it yet. We are still going through the draft report. So there is a mandate within the act itself that the committee be established, as well as a commission be established. That could happen sort of at the same time, but as it worked out in this case, we heard almost 2 years worth of evidence before the commission was launched. Now, the Justice Rouleau Commission can make recommendations for the current government and future government to take with respect to the current piece of legislation, to strengthen it perhaps, or to consider amending it or creating a completely new act to contemplate the situations that existed here in Ottawa and around the nation. But it's not binding on the government. It is not a legally binding precedent. Now we know Justin Trudeau and his government took a victory lap, said, see, I told you, we were justified. But that is not the case. Justice Rouleau was not carrying the role of a justice to make that determination. His opinion was that the steps, the factors that went into the invocation of the act were reasonable steps, all right? He wasn't required to weigh on whether the legal threshold had been met. And you also got to remember, Jamie, the opening words of Justice Rouleau's report, he also commented on this when he delivered this orally, is that reasonable people, upon reading this report, could easily come to the opposite conclusion that he did. So by no means was this an unequivocal endorsement of the actions of the Trudeau government. Now compare that to what happened in the federal court. We had two entities in Canada that launched an application for judicial review of the invocation of the act. The Canadian Constitution Foundation and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. A number of individuals were granted standing, also made representations. Justice Mosley had the benefit of reviewing all of the factors, all of the circumstances, but his mandate was very clear. His mandate was to determine whether that legal threshold was met by this government. Was there a national security emergency as defined by the Emergencies Act, and whether or not the actions taken by the Trudeau government were reasonable in the circumstances? He concluded unequivocally they were not. He trampled on civil liberties that Canadians have had with respect to their investments, their bank accounts, etc. People, I've heard anecdotally, people literally struggling to pay bills, going into default on loans and mortgages, which impacted their credit rating.
Yeah.
These are the direct actions of the Trudeau government, but particularly Chrystia Freeland, who claimed that those who were contributing $50, $20, $100 towards the expenses of the trucker convoy were foreign entities,
Yeah.
or they were engaged in terrorism-like activities, money laundering activities. Zero evidence of that, Jamie.
Well, I want to get to that in just a second because we do have a clip on that. I want to also remind people that not only is the use just unbelievably overpowering for what was going on, it was supposed to be a national emergency, right? The worst of the worst. You said it right off the top. It was basically confined to a few blocks in the nation's capital. I noticed when the judge put out his ruling, I think it was a Liberal MP from Windsor, was talking about the border being blocked. Right. But that was resolved using existing laws, existing powers by police, well before
Correct.
the Emergencies Act putting in.
Correct.
Coutts, Alberta was dealt with using the same thing, existing
Correct.
laws, existing powers.
Correct.
So it comes down to one area, the city of Ottawa. So let's cue up cut 2, because you did talk about this. Where did the government get their information from? Where was this money laundering evidence? Where was this terrorism connection? Let's do a little throwback Tuesday to some work he did in committee. Play cut 2.
You, as the most senior cabinet minister and the deputy prime minister, relied upon that initial story from the CBC and shared your concerns with Canadians regarding terrorism funding and money laundering. Your words, correct?
Let me be very clear. My principal concern when it comes to the illegal occupation and the illegal blockades is the economic harm that was done to Canada.
Let me be very clear, Minister Freeland. Your words several times in the House referred to terrorism funding and money laundering. Are you saying you didn't use those words?
I am speaking here today, and I am talking about the central motivation of our very serious
And
actions.
I'm here to ask you questions, and I expect, unlike question period, I expect a response. So my response is, do you recall using the words terrorism funding and money laundering in the House and reporting outside the House? Yes or no, Minister Freeland?
I believe if we were in a court of law where I think you once worked, that might be called badgering the witness, Mr. Brock.
You could never get a simple answer from that minister. You can't.
know,
It's impossible.
The hubris, the condescending nature of that Q&A was absolutely incredible. So to answer your question, the evidence that she received was from the liberal think tank CBC tax-funded corporation. That's
So
it.
they based all their decisions based on an article from the CBC, which doesn't seem to actually be linked or fact-checked.
Not at all. In fact, all of that reporting by the CBC in relation to those
They picked
earlier
the worst.
stories
Yes.
was all debunked.
Yes, absolutely it was.
Absolutely
It was
debunked.
horrible reporting.
There was some donations from the U.S., but well over 90% of all the donations came from hard-working Canadians.
Normal people.
Who were concerned about the draconian measures being imposed by this unethical, illegal government.
And this is a government, a minister in particular, that accuses everybody else of misinformation and disinformation. That whole couple of weeks was a bombardment by the Liberal and NDP government on the real facts of what was actually going on the ground.
Right. We have to remember one thing as well, and this is a question that was never answered. Of all the witnesses that appeared at the special joint committee, not one witness could answer this. They all acknowledged that plans were in place to ensure the truckers' safety, but the safety of people who lived in Ottawa. The police, in conjunction with the city of Ottawa, directed the truckers to park
That's right.
exactly where they parked, on Wellington and on side streets, and then gave them a base so that supplies could be brought back and forth, all done on the up and up, all done in advance of their arrival. So the question I asked that never got answered is, if this was a legal, organized, coordinated protest on the nation's capital, at what point in time did it become illegal? Of course, it was an inconvenience. All protests are inconvenient. But as Justice Mosley said, that does not constitute blowing horns, honking horns, partying, listening to music, using a hot tub, okay? There are
Or
rules.
you could have used the city of Toronto's example.
Right.
When the convoy or a spin-off convoy tried to go in front of Queen's Park in Toronto, the police moved them along.
That's
they
right.
didn't allow them to stop.
That's right. They coordinated a police approach to not allow that to establish itself and to remain within that corridor. So you're absolutely correct. But Justice Mosley basically said that in of itself, that inconvenience, that nuisance, that disturbance does not constitute, nor would it ever constitute, a national security emergency.
And if it was time to move them along, there are existing laws.
Absolutely.
You did not have to bring that. If it was
Under-
time,
there were municipal bylaws, there were
Start
provincial
ticketing,
laws,
absolutely.
right, and there were criminal laws.
all right, we're pretty much out of time. Always a pleasure. It goes so fast when I have you on the
certainly
show,
does.
as you know.
It
As
does.
always, the guest has the last word. Fire away.
You know what? This is, as I said to you earlier, this is a reminder. It's a wake-up call to Justin Trudeau and his government that you cannot control this country and control its citizens by acting like a dictator, by fudging the facts, interpreting the laws that you see fit. Our laws are expressly stated. This law was in effect for well over 30 years, well drafted, well articulated. The law was the law, and Justice Mosley has basically indicated this government was not at liberty to interpret to fit their narrative. A warning for all.
I agree with you absolutely 100% because the laws are set up in a way to keep government in check, keep politicians in check, and make sure that we are always looking out
We
for our
are
citizens.
a country that abides by the rule of law.
We should anyway.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Larry Brock, the Brockinator, back on the show again. We thank him for his time, the Member of Parliament for Brantford Brant. We thank you for yours. If you do like what you've heard on this show, what you've seen in this presentation, please like, comment, subscribe, and share this program. I guarantee you one thing. This message is not being heard on the mainstream media. You need to get this out, and we ask for your help in doing that. Please come back next Tuesday with 1:30 p.m. is our start time with new content for you. We will have that for you every single week. We appreciate it. Until then, remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint.